co-editor, of the Journal of Critical and Radical Social Work. Why is it necessary to speak about radical social work in the 21st century as opposed to any other kind of social work?
Okay. Well, if you look at many of the social work textbooks about the social work history, or you look at many of the international declarations about what social work is, there's so the international definition that the International Federation of Social Work puts together, it kind of gives the impression that we are a solid, unified profession. We all share the same value base. We've all got the same commitments. We're all committed to public welfare. We're all committed to enhancing human needs and human rights. The international definition of social work is one that I'm quite happy to sign up to, but there are elements that I'm less happy with. And the reason for that is because the international definition tries to cover the entire social work profession globally. And in doing so, it covers up, I think, some fundamental divisions in social work. Because social work is a contested profession. You know, we all like to think about social work and our wonderful history and what a great profession it is. Social work's got a horrible history as well as a very good history. You know, there were social workers who were active as social workers during the Third Reich and were involved, you know, implementing Hitler's laws. Social work in Greece started at the end of the Civil War, and the job of social workers in Greece at the end of the Civil War was to go and remove children from what were called red families, in other words, those who had been in the losing side of the Civil War when the generals took over. Social work in Spain developed in the 50s because, again, it was about removing children from those who had rebelled and who had lost to Franco and his forces as they took power in 1939. In Latin America, social workers have worked at ease, really, with all the various generals and coups and military regimes that existed in the 1980s. The irony is that some social workers in places like Argentina and Uruguay or Brazil, some social workers were working with the state and the system at the same time as some other social workers were being imprisoned and in fact killed by the regime because they were seen as being radicals and beyond the frame. So, on the one hand, we've got a horrible history of social work, and maybe I should add as well, it's not just Germany and Spain and Greece and Latin America. In Britain, you know, our own history goes back to the Charity Organisation Society, which historically was not at all a pleasant organisation, but was structured around the principles of demonising the poor. But even in the 50s and 60s, social workers were involved in sending young orphan children to Australia and Canada with £10 in their pocket and not really monitoring the horrors that happened to them when they arrived in Australia and Canada. So I'm certainly not excusing social work in Britain from that horrible history. So there's a horrible history. There's also social work which is about reforming people's lives, and probably the majority of social workers would see themselves as being tied to that. They think that we can help people who want to help themselves to change aspects of their life. We need some resources to do that. We need proper policies in place, but good social work can make a difference and it's worth defending. My own view is that's probably what the majority of social workers think they're coming into social work to do, to help people in some unspecified way, but nevertheless, in a positive way. But there's always been, from the very, very beginning, there's always been what I would call a radical kernel within social work. So if we think about that in Britain, that started off really as part of the settlement movement. So from the 1880s and the 1890s, there were people who were involved in social work settlements who saw themselves as social workers, but embedded themselves within the social movements of the 1880s, the 1890s, and the early part of the 20th century. The irony is that many of these social workers have actually been written out of social work's official history. So we have people like Sylvia Pankhurst. Sylvia Pankhurst is very, very well known in Britain as a suffragette and is the nicer one of the suffragette of the Pankhurst family because she split from her mum and her sisters around the war. She was a pacifist. She was a founder member of the Communist Party. What we don't hear so much about is her radical welfare programme. So during the First World War, she existed in the East End of London. She worked and campaigned in the East End of London, and she provided some services for some of the poorest communities in the capital at that point in time. So there were women whose families were destitute, husbands were fighting the war in France or had been killed or injured. The British Army weren't giving the money, they were literally destitute. Sylvia and her colleagues used to go with them to the public assistance committees and to the poor law commissions and advocate on their behalf about why they should be given money without having to work, and they should be given outdoor relief. This is basic advocacy skills. We would celebrate these as social work skills. Sylvia Pankhurst was doing this in the First World War. In December 1916, it's known as the hungry winter of the war, and there was severe hunger in Britain. And in the East End of London, facing this, Sylvia Pankhurst set up a community kitchen to provide good, nutritious food for families, especially for children, free milk for the children. Again, it seems to me this is good community social work that we would celebrate today. As we got close to Christmas, she realised that those children wouldn't have any toys. So she started to employ the mothers in factories to create toys which could then be sold to make sure that the children had a toy and that they would all have something to open at Christmas. This seems to me a way of thinking about the trauma of children and childhood and making sure that they had some aspect of play and bringing in play into those things. So Sylvia Pankhurst, because of her engagement in the anti-war movement and because of her history in the suffragette movement as a socialist and a feminist activist, was brought to think about social work in these ways. But if you look at any history book of social work, Sylvia Pankhurst does not appear. So why not? I think that is because she was a radical social worker. That's because she was a founder member of the Communist Party. And we can think of other examples. There's a woman called Mentona Mosa. Mentona Mosa trained in social work in London. She went back to her home, which was in Switzerland. She set up the first school of social work in Switzerland. She was an open lesbian woman in the 1920s and 1930s, which was really quite unusual. She then in the 1930s becomes the European chair of an organisation called Red Aid, which is involved in supporting refugees from Republican Spain as they flee Franco's troops. She set up the first school of social work in Switzerland, and yet if you look at the history books in Switzerland, she's written out of history. Why? Because I think she was a founder member of the Communist Party of Switzerland, and her politics makes her beyond the pale. In Spain, during the Civil War, there were some fantastic projects. There was an organisation called the Mujer Libre. This was an organisation of anarchist women. The anarchist women themselves wanted to go and fight at the front, but to do that they had to have creches and nurseries and canteens to provide food for their children, and so they set up collective provision of nurseries, of canteens, of places that their kids could stay, collectively providing to meet those needs that families had, but also to let them go and fight with a gun against the fascists in Spain. But there was also some other projects. There was a woman called Esme Odgers. Esme Odgers, again, was a member of the Communist Party in Australia. She came to join the international brigades in Spain, but actually she met up with some other men from America and Britain, and they were involved in setting up something called the Plan. It still exists. It's a voluntary sector organisation today. And the Plan was a support network for orphan children in the middle of the Civil War. And the plan was that they were going to set up writing networks so that children in Spain could have pen pals with children in America and Britain, and they could share their lives, and they would have families who would talk about normal things with them, in inverted commas. And this was about thinking beyond the war. But they also had to deal with those children's traumas, and so they were looking after them in the children's colonies, they were called. And to deal with that, they started to explore the use of art and drama as therapeutic techniques to deal with children's trauma in a time of war. And these were some of the earliest examples of art and drama as therapeutic devices in that context. It seems to me these are something that we should celebrate, and yet Esme Odgers is not referred to as a social work pioneer. So I think from the very beginning, radical social work has been there, but radical social work has been written out of our history. And that allows people to say that when radical social work came about, it was only really a movement of the 60s and the 70s. Radical social work in the 60s and 70s was vitally important, but there was a longer history. And radical social work of the 60s and 70s came about not because social workers suddenly became radicalised, but because the world in the 60s and the 70s was radicalising, that the movements of the time against racism and gender oppression and against war and for a better world were developing out of what we call the movements of the 60s. And this coincided in Britain and America with the expansion of social work. And of course, many of the people who are now going on to social work courses were people who were on a social work course Monday to Friday, and on a Saturday were in a demonstration against war in Vietnam, or a demonstration for abortion rights, or a demonstration against racism. And therefore the radicalism of the 1960s in social work actually came from outside social work, and I think that's an important lesson for us. If we look back, the radicalism of Esme Odgers came from the Spanish Civil War. The radicalism of Antonia Moser came from her engagement with the Communist Party in the 1930s. The radicalism of Sylvia Pankhurst came from the suffragette movement and the movement of trade unions and the anti-imperial movement. But they brought the insights of the movement into social work to challenge the dominant ideas within social work. And in a sense, I would argue, that Swan tried to do that with the radical movement against neoliberal globalisation in 1999 by bringing the insights of the movement in to challenge the ways that social work thinks about it. So therefore social work, radical social work has been there since the very, very beginning. And it's been there, it's important for us to say that, and it's important for us to say that because social work remains a contested profession where there are some who continue to pathologise social work service users and those who look for more radical solutions. And we are all part of the social work profession together, and there is a live, ongoing debate about what social work should be, and that's something that we should enjoy and join and be part of.
So it's really interesting hearing about that history of radical social work, and there's so many important points there for us to take into our practice and our thinking and training today.